Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 301. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. I got a lot to cover on today's show. Great power competition with Russia and China both heating up. The FBI really is provoking China, and I will get into that. So share the show. You find it at the Libertarian Institute. We repost the show on the blog at antiwar.com. Video version goes up at YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee. You can listen to the audio version as a podcast anywhere. It's also on the Libertarian Institute All podcast feed, along with the Scott Horton Show, Liberty Weekly, and other great podcasts. You can support the show by donating at Patreon or Subscribestar. We also have the link to crypto that's in the show notes page. And you can support the show by doing your CBD shopping at Paloma Verde. PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Promo code PEACE. That will save you 20% when you spend $75 or more. And it gets the show a kickback. This is really a great way to help out the show. I know a lot of people, especially in the libertarian community, already understand the benefits of CBD. The products at Paloma Verde are high quality. You could check the lab test results right there on their website. We've been partnered with Paloma Verde for well over a year, and I only get great reviews and feedback from people who have bought their products. And I've myself, Connor Freeman, Will Porter, I've all had and found benefits with the Paloma Verde CBD products as well. So, we're recommending this, and it's a great way to help out the show. It helps us to cover costs and, look at getting some new and improved gear to help make the quality of the show even better. So help yourself, help the show, PalomaVerdeCBD.com, promo code PEACE. All right, let's get into it. First story I have today, I wrote for antiwar.com on July 10th. UN says Ukrainian Russian forces use civilians as human shields. The United Nations says Kiev and Moscow soldiers used elderly and disabled civilians as human shields. In one situation, Ukrainian soldiers hid in a nursing home, provoking an attack that killed dozens of residents. The report by the UN Office of the High Commissioner says Ukrainian and Russian forces allied with Moscow are using civilians as human shields. Both Russian armed forces and affiliated armed groups, as well as Ukrainian armed forces, took up positions either in residential areas or near civilian objects from which they launched military operations without taking measures for the protection of the civilians, the report concludes. The report detailed one incident of Kiev soldiers using human shields in Ukraine's Donbass region shortly after the Russian invasion. According to the UN Office for the High Commissioner, the residents of a nursing home in the Luhansk region were unable to evacuate because Ukrainian forces mined the roads around the facility. As Russian-aligned forces pushed into the region, Ukrainian soldiers entered a building where civilians were residing, and then battle broke out with the invading troops. On March 7th, soldiers from Ukrainian armed forces entered the care house, which is a nursing home, that's just the term the UN report uses, where older patients and residents with disability and staff were located. On March 9th, soldiers from a Russia-affiliated group engaged in exchange of fire with soldiers from Ukrainian armed forces, although it remains unclear which side opened fire. The report describes that the Ukrainian soldiers took up this position because it would be an advantageous military position. So, and we'll get into this here. Russian-aligned forces attacked the facility 2 days later, causing a fire to break out. According to the report, the total number of deaths is unclear, but the number appears to be about 50. On March 11th, the fire started and spread across the care house. Some staff and patients fled the care house. It continued. Russian affiliated armed groups met the survivors and provided them with assistance. According to various accounts, at least 22 patients survived the attack. The exact number of persons killed is unknown. In a previous portion, they say there were 71, I believe, patients, and then an additional number of staff. And so Without knowing the number of staff that survived, maybe 50 is a good guess to the number that have died. Officials in Kiev initially portrayed the deaths of the civilians in the nursing home as an atrocity committed solely by Russian forces. However, the AP says the UN findings show, and this is the Associated Press that wrote this, Ukraine's armed forces bear a large and perhaps equal share of the blame for what happened. A second alleged use of human shields was committed by Russian troops. The report says that 360 residents, including 47 children and 5 persons with disabilities, were forced by Russian armed forces to stay for 28 days in the basement of a school they had been using as their base. The UN claims the civilians were provided with insufficient care and 10 elderly people died as a result. And, these are all cases where, well, the second case is on the Russian forces for doing that, but the first case, it's the fog of war situation. This is why we should oppose this warfare, and we should encourage the U.S. to stay out of the conflict in Ukraine rather than encouraging it as we have so far, and as I'll get into later in the show explaining that. But horrible things are going to happen, and it's not, it is the fault of the people involved, but you can't say, oh, all the blame is on Russia for committing war crimes here, because, the Ukrainian forces are hiding in nursing homes. All right. Russia's Medvedev warns the U.S. trying to punish nuclear power risks humanity. This from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com on June 6th. Former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev on Wednesday warned the U.S. against trying to punish Russia for its war in Ukraine, saying doing so would risk humanity since Russia has the world's largest nuclear arsenal. And so this is a pretty gross thing, right? If you do have people who are committing war crimes, and certainly Russia's invasion of Ukraine does make Vladimir Putin a war criminal, although the guy, has committed past crimes, as many world leaders have. And, to compare him to U.S. presidents, the U.S. presidents have probably committed worse war crimes, but that, doesn't make him innocent. And so, Putin and other Russian officials one day standing trial for this war and other war crimes would not be against justice. However, if we look at what happens when a country has nuclear weapons, well, look at the U.S. and Israel, who are both under, or there have been like spurs of investigations against these two countries by the International Criminal Court, the ICC, for crimes committed against Palestinians or Afghans and things like that. And the U.S. under Trump sanctioned the ICC. Under Biden, they lift those sanctions, but said that they weren't going to, participate in any kind of investigations that would target U.S. or Israelis. So the U.S. isn't maybe as bold and as gross as the way they say it, but this is essentially the American policy too. And Russia just says it a little bit more bluntly, which in some way is, should be almost appreciated, that it's very open and transparent, so you know what you get, rather than the U.S. always couching their language and then standing on artificial soapbox. Now, Ukraine says, I think this was in the BBC, it is investigating 21,000 reports of war crimes that happened in Ukraine. I'm sure that this number is probably somewhat realistic, looking at the Russian invasion, with how many different homes and things like that have been destroyed. The idea that any or most of these people are going to get justice, or that in the fog and the chaos of war, you're going to be able to find the particular people responsible. In some cases, with the amount of video that exists now, it is probably possible that they could catch and try some of these war criminals. But I think this is going to create some international problems. I mean, can you imagine, let's say, if the special operator Eddie Gallagher had been tried in an Iraqi court rather than a U.S. court? He ultimately was pardoned by President Trump, but had that happened, I think it would have been very hard for the Iraqi government to have, kept Gallagher long term, especially after he was pardoned by Trump. And so I think, when you look at this kind of thing, in a realistic sense, I think it's going to be very hard to pull off. It'll be good justice if it could happen. No, I don't think any Russian officials will actually end up going to jail in any way. And it's, probably foolish to try to do that. The focus should be on ending the war, especially from the West, rather than targeting Russian officials for war crimes. That it's especially the hypocrisy from the Western officials on this issue, where they're all guilty of these same war crimes. It really just doesn't necessarily work, and so. Some people will probably be caught and convicted within Ukraine, but I would guess that most of these war crimes end up going unpunished. And any war crimes committed by the Ukrainian side, by the way, I assume will almost all go unpunished. Maybe, if something is really horrific, like the Azov battalion does something really, really bad to like a Jewish neighborhood or Russian neighborhood, maybe there would be enough pressure to kind of crack down on it and say, oh, see, we regulate this some. But my guess is, in general, these groups are going to get away with, most of these war crimes, whether it be Ukrainian or Russian forces. Next article I wrote for the Libertarian Institute on July 5th. U.S. Special Forces vets near front lines training Ukrainian soldiers. The New York Times spoke to several retired American special operators who say they are providing training to Ukrainian troops near the battlefield and even planning missions against Russian soldiers. Since Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24th, the U.S. has transferred nearly $7 billion in weapons to Kiev's military. However, American forces that were training Ukrainian soldiers shortly before the Russian attack have since withdrawn from Ukraine. Many of the weapon systems Washington provided to Kiev are unfamiliar to its soldiers. To cover training gaps, the U.S. and its allies are now bringing Ukrainian soldiers to other European countries to learn and train on the new weapons. The U.S. has reportedly deployed CIA officers to Kiev to gather and give intelligence for the Ukrainian military and transfer intelligence to the Ukrainian military, while other Western allies have placed special operators on the ground to facilitate weapons transfers on the battlefield. The vets cited by the Times say they have used their personal savings and crowdfunding to bankroll their paramilitary work, though they did not say whether the former soldiers are coordinating with the Pentagon at all. Also, this idea of crowdfunding is kind of interesting, right? Because I think most of us assume that crowdfunding is something like the great project that Eric July has going on right now with his comic book, right? I think he's raised almost $1 million already. Like, huge congrats to Eric July. That's really awesome. And so, that's great. But I have to imagine that crowdfunding would be a pretty easy way for the CIA or other intelligence agencies to funnel money and give legitimacy. And so if the Pentagon, say, was, having, funneling money through different accounts, or having various employees, donate $100 or $1,000 to various former special operations forces, it seems like that would be a pretty good way to covertly fund the support, because a lot of this is a lot of the donations are anonymous, or and of course successful drives are going to get some grassroots support, even if a lot of it does come through the military or the CIA intelligence community or something like that. I mean, that's just speculation, but the way it's phrased in the Times just suggests that this is legitimate, because they're either doing it themselves or through crowdfunding. And I am skeptical of crowdfunding if it really produces or could be used by the intelligence community. While a long line of countries initially allowed their citizens to travel to Ukraine to fight as volunteers, President Joe Biden has since urged Americans to stay home, as several nationals have gone missing after arriving. A number of foreign fighters fighting for Kiev have been captured, and some even sentenced to death by separatist forces in Donetsk and Luhansk, while Moscow has reported that the mercenaries will not enjoy the protection usually granted to uniformed combatants. And so I wonder if Moscow is going to make a distinction between like the Foreign Legion type forces who are fighting under a Ukrainian flag versus people presumably like the Special Operations Fed, who's almost acting as a mercenary in Ukraine. All right, next up, we have the latest arms transfer to Ukraine. U.S. announces $400 million weapons package. The Biden administration announced a new weapons package for Ukraine that includes high mobility artillery rocket systems. And I believe I've been pronouncing this wrong. Somebody in the military corrected me. It's HIMARS. HIGH and then MARS, so HIMARS, and then also 150 millimeter artillery ammunition and tactical vehicles. According to the Pentagon, the new report includes for the HIMARS 3 tactical vehicles, 155 millimeter artillery ammunition, demolition munitions, counter battery systems, spare parts, and other equipment. And of course, the money just continues to pile on here, and it does seem to be more advanced and sophisticated equipment as we go. Now, with the U.S. sending more and more advanced equipment to Ukraine, there are people within the Pentagon who are getting a little edgy about it. Not necessarily because of who these weapons are going to, but because who might one day get their hands on these weapons, including Russian forces. And so the Pentagon, a Pentagon agency wants to send weapons inspectors to Ukraine. An official from the Pentagon's Defense Security Cooperation Agency, DSCA, said Thursday that the U.S. military leaders should consider sending weapons inspectors to Ukraine to monitor the billions of dollars in U.S. arms pouring into the country. Currently, the U.S. is relying on the word of Ukrainian officials to ensure that the weapons are being properly used and stored, although the New York Times reported that CIA operatives are on the ground in Ukraine, mostly in Kiev. The Times also said that special operations forces from other NATO countries are inside of Ukraine, serving as conduits for Western weapons. The DSCA is an arm of the Pentagon in charge of arms sales, and the suggestion to send weapons inspectors comes as members of Congress have been calling for more oversight of Ukraine aid. And so, we had Rand Paul try to hold up a bill on this and kind of get blocked. My guess is they don't want to do anything quite as significant as appointing like the Afghan Reconstruction Inspector General, but maybe they do want to start providing some oversight here. Now, of course, the problem is sending these inspectors to Ukraine will almost necessarily be putting American uniformed soldiers on the ground in somewhere near the front lines in Ukraine, and that is very concerning. I'm sure as much as the Pentagon has some legitimacy to their concerns that this technology could fall into the hands of Russia. Now, my solution to that, of course, would be to stop sending our military technology to Ukraine so it can't fall into the hands of Russia. Next up, Dave DeCamp. On July 11th in Kiev, Senator Blumenthal says he hopes to see hand-to-hand insurgency in Russian-occupied Ukraine. This happened last week. Lindsey Graham, along with Blumenthal, went to Ukraine, and this is the very disturbing comment from Blumenthal. Long-range artillery is very, very important, but so is hand-to-hand insurgency. That was what we are hoping to see in eastern Ukraine. That is what we are hoping to see in eastern Ukraine, is what Blumenthal said. I mean, I guess I understand that maybe he says insurgency is a way to liberation, and it's just kind of forgetting to say that part. But, I mean, this is going to be bloody and terrible for the Ukrainians to continue to fight, even after the Russians have conquered the territory. And the idea of how the U.S. is going to get these weapons into Russian-occupied territory is also concerning. Additionally, both Blumenthal and Graham voiced their support for an insurgency in eastern Ukraine in the latest sign that the U.S. plans to support Ukraine in its war against Russia for years to come. But the main purpose of the visit was to discuss a plan to designate Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Currently, only Iran, North Korea, Syria, and Cuba are on the designated state sponsors of terror. Cuba's designation was lifted by by Obama, but the Trump administration put Havana back on the list as one of its last foreign policy moves. Now, this is one of the worst things that could happen. I think it would essentially permanently destroy the relationship between Washington and Moscow that has to find some way to recover, not only to end this war, but eventually arms control agreements between the two sides will have to be negotiated. We can't have this nuclear brinksmanship go on indefinitely, and so discussions had to happen. But if look at the way the U.S. treats these four countries, particularly on this list, it's very disturbing. And of course, almost all these designations are political. In every case, there's no group on country on here that supports the Islamic State. All of them, Iran and Syria directly fight against them, and of course North Korea and Cuba kind of are in a different situation geopolitically. So the list is a political list, and it's like official forever enemies of the U.S. list, and the sanctions that come along with it will destroy the U.S.-Russian relationship, and so hopefully it doesn't happen, but I am very concerned it will, and I've been talking about this on the show for a couple months, as particularly these two senators have pushed this bill over and over again. Vladimir Putin says peace talks with Ukraine will be harder with time. And, I just wanted to talk about this in relation to the past couple of stories, right? So we're pouring all these weapons into Ukraine, ensuring that this war is going to go on. But the longer this war goes on, the more Ukrainian territory Russia is going to take. Now, the problem with that is the more territory Russia has, at the very least, the more leverage Russia has, but likely that means the more territorial concessions Kiev will have to make. And Kiev has been pretty defiant about making any territorial concessions. And so with these dynamics going on, the U.S. policy is a recipe for a long war. Now, look, I'm not saying that it's a great thing that Russia is able to invade Ukraine and then enter into negotiations a few months later and solidify some of their territorial gains. Wars of aggression to take territory are something that should be condemned, and I've done so several times on the show. However, sometimes that is better than allowing the war to go on for 3, 4, 5 years and having these negotiations with Russia to settle this conflict, especially because I think this conflict, represents a spillover of problems between NATO, Europe, Washington, and Russia at large, right? The Ukrainians are kind of paying for some of the provocative things the other Western countries have done. Now, of course, Kiev is the main issue, and in Ukraine is the main issue for Russia, and that's why they're exacting the pressure and punishment there. But a wider agreement, I think, was very probably possible in the early days of the war, definitely before the war, where the West made some concessions in other areas of Europe. And, that would allow the Ukrainians to keep more of their territory. But the longer this goes on, the less territory that's going to be up for talks, even with Western concessions, which, they're not going to make. It's going to be Kiev that has to probably make all the concessions here to end this war. Next up, White House says U.S. won't push Ukraine to negotiate with Russia. John Kirby, who, remember, was the Pentagon spokesperson, is now the National Security Council's coordinator for strategic communications, said Sunday that the U.S. will not push Ukraine to reach a negotiated settlement with Russia, even if the Biden administration thinks it's the right thing to do. And this is amazing, right? Where if you're in Washington, apparently they're making something of the same calculations that I am on this show, that a negotiated settlement at this point would allow Ukraine to hang on to more territory and will probably allow Ukraine to have more leverage than it currently does. But, they're going to allow this war to go on and fight. And, they will publicly say, well, with all these weapons, eventually Ukraine will have a better negotiating position. But with every weapon the U.S. has sent, Russia has just, maybe been had to be a little bit more brutal, but it's just continuing to take more and more territory. It hasn't really mattered what weapons the U.S. are sending. And first it was artillery, and now it's, the long range rockets, and they're going to, air defenses is a new one. We're sending air defenses, but they're going to continue to say, it's this other weapon that we need to be able to turn back Russia. And it's not just there. What the Washington policy really is that the more weapons that we could give Ukraine, the slower Russia will take territory. Of course, that means the more Ukrainians and Russians are going to die in this war, and that's ultimately what I think the White House is seeking here, and why ultimately the White House has no interest in pushing Ukraine to negotiate. Next up, I wrote this for the antiwar.com on July 10th. At G20 summit, Washington and Moscow trade blame for diplomatic freeze. Secretary of State Antony Blinken used his platform at the Group of 20 summit to accuse Russia of having no interest in negotiations. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said Moscow believes that Washington has at fault for the frozen relationship. In Bali, Indonesia, Blinken condemned Russia for having no interest in diplomacy. Blinken said the problem is this: we see no signs whatsoever that Russia at this moment in time is prepared to engage in any meaningful diplomacy. The top American diplomat claims several other countries have engaged with Russia in recent months, and all report Moscow is not prepared to seriously engage in talks to resolve the conflict in Ukraine. Blinken did not specify which countries have spoken with Moscow. So this is really interesting, and I'm curious what countries these are, because as I point out here, last month Turkish officials offered to host talks aimed at allowing grain to be shipped from Ukrainian ports. Moscow promised not to target cargo ships carrying food products, while Kiev declined to engage in negotiations. Additionally, Lavrov said that the Ukrainian negotiation team made a workable proposal in April, but Kiev later broke off talks. Lavrov said the Kremlin's position is that the West is responsible for the diplomatic freeze, and it was willing to engage when the U.S. was ready. It was not us that abandoned all the contact. It was the U.S., he said. If they don't want to talk, it's their choice. Blinken went on to say that the White House believes Russia will only engage in negotiations after Western weapons transfers to Ukraine will force Moscow to the negotiation table and give Kiev the best hand possible. And this is, like I was just saying, the White House knows that this isn't going to happen. They know that Russia is going to win this war if it goes on, and that Russia is just going to take more and more territory. But publicly, we have even our top diplomats saying that, hey, the solution here is to just give Ukraine more weapons until they get the upper hand, which isn't going to happen, because if you look at the amount of territory they've lost in the past couple months, they're not going to have a better position to negotiate from when they were 2 months ago. And that's just going to continue to be the case, that it was best for them to negotiate in March, maybe even with the proposal that Lavrov said Russia was open to, that Ukraine proposed. And the longer this war goes on, the more Russia is going to demand, and the more leverage they're going to have to make those demands. Lavrov said Blinken's position is a recipe for a long war. If the West doesn't want to talks to take place, but wishes for Ukraine to defeat Russia on the battlefield, because both views have been expressed, then perhaps there's nothing to talk about with the West. Blinken has not spoken with Lavrov, said February 15th. On Sunday, Vice President Kamala Harris said the Biden administration is attempting to secure the release of WNBA star Brittany Griner from Russia. Grenier pled guilty to a drug possession charge and is facing up to 10 years in a Russian prison. It's unclear how the White House intends to get the Kremlin to release the basketball star without engaging with the Russian government. And look, during the Trump administration, as hawkish and as aggressive as he was towards Beijing, he was able to engage in a small amount of diplomacy to get one of the basketball players, his last name is Ball, released from China. And so, these things can happen. They can be done. But if the U.S. has no contact with Moscow, they're not going to happen. So Kaliningrad continues to be an issue. This is the region of Russia that's an exclave sandwiched between Lithuania and Poland along the Baltic Sea. And Lithuania has said that they're going to impose a travel ban, essentially a shipment ban on rail going from Russia to its exclave of Kaliningrad, and this has caused some pretty serious tensions to break out in the Baltic region. So on July 8th, Dave DeCamp wrote, Moscow warned Lithuania and the EU that it could take harsh measures if the embargo imposed on Kaliningrad was not lifted. If the situation does not stabilize in the coming days, then Russia will take harsh measures against Lithuania and the European Union, the Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman said. The issue has taken too long to resolve. Kaliningrad is a Russian enclave which is sandwiched between Lithuania and Poland on the Black Sea. Lithuania has recently begun enforcing EU sanctions on goods traveling by rail, a move that Moscow says risks escalation. Now, in addition to Kaliningrad, there is a similar issue now between Russia and Norway. And I wrote this for the Libertarian Institute on July 6th. The latest point in confrontation between NATO and Russia is the Svalbard archipelago located midway between Norway and the North Pole. Moscow claims Oslo is restricting trade between the island's hundreds of Russian residents, and a top member of the Russian legislature is now calling for Moscow to leave its agreement with Oslo that resolved the territorial dispute over the far north archipelago. During a discussion about Norway restricting trade to the islands in the Russian Duma, the body's speaker requested the head of the chamber's International Affairs Committee to look into denouncing the treaty. The agreement was signed in 2010. And so Norway, of course, this would put a very serious confrontation between Russia and NATO in place if this cannot be resolved. And as Dave DeCamp points out, Finland has since seized Russian freight cargo. Over 800 cars were taken. Now, this is serious. I wish I had spent more time on it, but I do want to move on and talk about something that may be more important, especially to hear us in America. Yellen looks to gain support for Russian oil price cap on Asia trip. Dave DeCamp wrote this for antiwar.com on July 11th. And so Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, is headed to Asia, and while there, she's going to try to get countries to put a cap on the price they will pay for Russian oil. Now, I've seen this cap discussed at being under $100 a barrel, and if that's the case, it's essentially, I think, a ban on Russian oil, and this is going to do major damage to the global economy if this is put in place. And while Yellen claims it will divert economic catastrophe, JP Morgan warns attempting to price cap on Russian oil could make oil $380 a barrel. Analysts are worrying that a U.S. proposed idea of explored by the G7 to impose a price cap on Russian oil could backfire and have devastating consequences. A new report from J.P. Morgan Chase said that oil could shoot up to a stratospheric $380 per barrel if Russia responds to the price cap by reducing oil output. And my guess is that, is how Russia would respond to inflict pain on the West. And so this is what we have to look forward to with the Western campaign against Russia. Now, a few notes on Turkey. Turkey is really putting a lot of pressure on Finland and Sweden, the two Nordic countries that are set to join NATO at this point. They just have to move through a few more hurdles. But one of those hurdles is they have to get treaty approval from each particular country. So I believe Canada and the UK have already completed this. I don't know what other countries have. I'm sure more of the 28 members have. I don't think the US has actually moved all the way through with this process. I believe I saw Josh Hawley was going to vote against it. I assume Rand Paul will as well. But it will most definitely pass the U.S. Senate. But here, Turkey is saying that if Sweden and Finland don't follow through on all their obligations in the 10-point memorandum signed between the three nations, then they will not approve of NATO membership for the two countries, and then their ascension into NATO will essentially be stifled. And then I talked about this on the last show. Turkey held a Russian ship that Ukraine claimed was carrying grain from Western countries. This has apparently been resolved, and the ship has been released. All right, so important news here from London. I wrote this up at the Libertarian Institute. FBI and MI5 named Chinese government as top threat to business. While traveling to London to meet with his British counterpart, the head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation warned Western business leaders that their companies could be impacted by crime from Beijing. During a joint press conference attended by executives in various financial sectors, MI5 Director General Ken McCallum cautioned that China presents the most significant threat. By volume, most of what we see at risk from the Chinese Communist Party aggression is not, so to speak, my stuff, it's yours. The world's leading expertise, technology, research, and commercial advantage development, and held by people in this room and others like you. So what they did, Ray and McCallum, is they invited all these executives and business leaders and said that, look, hey, Russia in this here, FBI Director Christopher Wray also claimed that China seeks to steal innovation from Western firms. We've seen the regional bureaus of China's MSS, Ministry of State Security, key and specifically on the innovation of certain Western companies it wants to ransack. He added, I'm talking about companies everywhere from big cities to small towns to Fortune hundreds to startups, folks that focus on everything from aviation to AI to pharmacy. Ray pushed corporate leaders to work with the FBI and MI5, insisting we're not just in the business of articulating the problem, we're doing something about it together with MI5, with the private sector itself, with some other partners. He also warned that China is insulating its economy from potential Western sanctions that could come if Beijing ordered its military to take over Taiwan. The meeting between the two intelligence chiefs came days after President Joe Biden and Prime Minister Boris Johnson signed off on a new NATO security strategy, which names China a top threat. Following a major summit in Madrid last week, the alliance released its new strategic concept document stating Beijing poses a systematic challenge to Euro-Atlantic security. An additional source of friction between Beijing and Washington came after the U.S. ambassador to China recently demanded that the Chinese Communist Party stop spreading what he called Russian lies. On Wednesday, the National Counterintelligence and Security Center also issued a bulletin warning state and local governments that Beijing is stepping up its information warfare. Now, we had a response from China, and I wrote this for the Libertarian Institute on July 8th with Will Porter. Beijing has rejected allegations from the U.S. and British officials that it is stealing from Western firms, calling the claim completely far-fetched, while slamming the United States as the biggest threat to world peace and development. Foreign Ministry spokesperson Zhao Lijian responded to the charges during his daily press briefing on Thursday, urging Washington and London to cast away imagined demons and stop playing up the China threat. The allegations against China are completely far-fetched, and the so-called cases they list are pure shadow casting, Zhao said. This is the typical example of a thief crying, "Stop thief." We deplore this type of despicable and deceitful gambit. On Wednesday, as I detailed before, the McCallum and the Ray press conference I mentioned in this article, and then I continue. Zhao, however, argued that the claims are motivated by the entrenched Cold War zero-sum mentality and ideological prejudice against Beijing, going on to slam Washington as an aggressive imperial power. The U.S. was not at war for only 16 through its 240 plus years of history, which made it known as the most warlike nation in the history of the world, he said, adding that the United States has abused its economic, scientific, and military dominance and stoked division and conflict around the world. And of course, this came as Blinken and the Chinese Foreign Minister Yi were expected to meet in Bali during the G20. Now, I don't have anything on that, but I do have China accuses the U.S. of technological terrorism for its sanctions on Chinese chips, and this just kind of adds to some of what I was talking about before. And then I'll mention this. The Japanese government has lodged a protest with Beijing after spotting a Chinese and Russian ship near the disputed Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea. It's very much unclear to me what's going on here. It's possible that China and Russia were carrying out some kind of joint maneuvers in the region, but the narrative of actually what happened is there was a warship, a Russian warship in the area, but I believe it was trying to avoid a typhoon, and a Chinese frigate then, I guess, approached the Russian warship and warned it to get out of the territorial waters of the Senkaku Islands. Now, again, it's possible that this was a joint maneuver to somehow show that China was in control of these territorial islands and Russia respects that control. It could have also just been kind of not coincidence, just a bunch of things happening at the same time. You know, you got the typhoon coming through. China then tells Russia to leave. Russia's then able to leave, and they leave. And Japan then points their finger and claims there's some kind of coordination because Russia and China have stepped up their coordination in this region over the past few months. But it's entirely possible that that's not going on at all. So questions remain, but this is an example of why the U.S. shouldn't give security guarantees over the Senkaku Islands because, we really don't want to fight a war with Russia and China over some rots sticking out of the East China Sea. All right, everybody, that's where I'm wrapping up the show today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. And, for the past 300 episodes, I try to keep the special interviews that I do for the 00 episodes a little bit shorter on the intro and outro. But today I just want to take a minute to say a special thank you to everybody who, even if you just listen to the show, you don't share the show or anything like that. Everybody who listens, that's why we do the show, because people listen. So we really appreciate it. But anybody who particularly takes the time to share the show or recommend it to somebody, the show's growing because of you. And so please keep that up because we really need to keep going. We need to spread this message. Increasingly we get less and less from, even as the show grows, it's not that we're gaining more points in the algorithms and more people are seeing the posts in the show on Twitter just naturally getting exposed to it. It's because people are recommending the show to new people, and that's why it's getting out there. So even though we're hampered in the algorithms, y'all are keeping the show going, and I appreciate it so much. If you could donate, that's even better. Just note, I will be at Freedom Fest this week, and so my output at the Libertarian Institute will be a little bit scaled back, but I'm really excited to meet so many great people at Freedom Fest. I will be at a panel during that conference, and I think that's about all I have. I'm recording the next episode of the show with Connor Freeman early today. We will both be at Freedom Fest, and so we may record something there, but we're recording a show early today for Thursday's show on Iran. So y'all have that to look forward to, and I'll talk to you again soon.